Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Slingshot from levy.org, produced by Landry Bone. Hold it, Landry. I forgot to get my notes up. Okay. The Slingshot, a twice-monthly show, was created to discuss current events through the lens of a core panel of experts. With us, we have Rudy Matthew Vorkapic. Before Rudy moved to New Orleans from Chicago 20 years ago, he was a well-respected news editor and reporter. After the levees broke, he launched the brilliant and hilarious satirical newspaper, the New Orleans Levy newspaper, with its motto, "We don't hold anything back." Also joining the panel is Stuart Loeb. Stuart was born in New Orleans, got engineering degrees from Tulane, then moved away only to come back just in time for Hurricane George in 1998 and all the fun we've had since then. And last is me, Sandy Rosenthal. I moved to New Orleans when I was 24, worked a whole bunch of advertising jobs, and then when the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina, I founded the grassroots group, levees.org. And today is our premiere episode of the Slingshot from levees.org, where we're going to be discussing current events. And today our topic is Hurricanes Helene and Milton. So, Stuart, how about you start with us?
Sure. Well, it's my experience with hurricanes started with Hurricane Betsy, and been through a number of them here locally, and it was that usual, not normal, but that typical feeling of dread watching this thing come across the Gulf, and then when it became clear it was going to go into Florida, my immediate worries for a local area subsided. I was, confident we'd get through it with no trouble. But I was looking at Florida and considering, how are they going to evacuate if they need to evacuate the Tampa area? Can they use contraflow? Where can they go? How far up do they go? If the hurricane is tracking northerly, it's just going to follow them up the coast. So one of the things that we have to rethink as a society and in our governments at all levels have to rethink is what it means to evacuate and how many people can evacuate, and what constraints we have to put on things that we thought would work, like, for example, contraflow, in which we've tried a couple of times here in New Orleans, but it never really worked well. And it's based entirely on personally owned vehicles. So there are people who are left behind. And then there was a disastrous incident in Texas with 24 people killed in a bus that caught fire sitting in stop and go traffic during what was the evacuation for Harvey, I think that was. So, and the other thing about contraflow is that, if we focus on that specifically, is that hurricanes now there's an acceleration in how fast they intensify.
Right.
So the 72 hours that the city of New Orleans says it needs to effect, or it's the state of Louisiana actually says that it needs for contraflow, we don't usually get that, or we don't always get it now. These hurricanes can come up, go to Category 5 overnight, come right in, and we only get 48 hours notice. Even Katrina, we thought that thing was going into Apalachicola on Friday, and Sunday they're telling us to get out within 24 hours. So,
and if I could jump in, Stuart, if that's okay, about
Sure.
that contraflow. So you're absolutely right. The contraflow did not take into account people without a car, without credit cards, without road experience, and without family out of town that they could go visit. But Stuart, that contraflow for the people with cars got the entire city evacuated well in advance of the storm. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, why did the city decide not to stop doing contraflow? Because I know they did.
Well, I think
decided to abandon it.
Yeah, I think the ultimate answer in the future is when we all have personal drone devices and we're all able to just go lift up ourselves, and the contraflow will be up in the air. But Just before you say, I remember I was in the contraflow as well. And, you know, my wife and I, we had woken up on that Sunday morning and turned on the TV and saw, you know, that it was a category 5 and it expanded to the entire Gulf. So, you know, we did what everyone, you know, usually do in that situation. We made our bed and then got out, you know. But the contraflow, I mean, it worked, but you're absolutely right. There were a lot of people who got left behind for all kinds of different reasons. I couldn't agree with that more.
Maybe that's the reason that they decided not to do it. They said, why should you have a system that costs a lot of money and a lot of manpower? The police have to do it, then the state police, that leaves a tenth of the population behind. Anyway, that's really an interesting question. And then
there are also still the political questions of, you know, can states get along where you want your neighbors to come up by you? Those are always issues. I mean, we experienced that here in New Orleans, just going over the bridge, let alone going into Mississippi or Alabama or Texas. So these are all, you know, these are all still issues that I don't think any other states have really meted out. I think we're the only one who's actually really ever kind of pulled that off.
You know, we're probably the three of us here. It's 3 people. We're not that many, but not a whole lot of people in the country have ever had to evacuate.
Right.
And really know what it means.
And it's a scary time because I remember being on that road, and the one thing you didn't want to do is cut somebody off or get mad if somebody cut you off, because while everyone was working together, it was still that uneasy kind of feeling underlying everything about, you know, what's going to happen. Well, where are we going? What are we coming back to? And
in the case of Hurricane Katrina, we had to go. There was no thinking, well, maybe I'll stay. You either stayed because you had to, or you got out, or you couldn't get out. But there are a lot of hurricanes where, you know, since then, well, should I go? Should I stay? Should I go? That alone is stressful.
Well, it's, to Stuart's absolute point, we don't have time now. There just isn't the time. All of the storms that even the one that came close to us, I mean, that developed in a heartbeat. And we couldn't go. We did, and when we
Francine,
yes. When Francine came, I mean, we talked about it. Do we stay? Do we go? And then it was really just keeping up with it minute by minute, almost hour by hour, for sure. But to decide, well, you know, you're going to take my 2 young girls, 17 and 13. You know, I don't really want them to sit through a category 3 or higher. You know, we've come close to that a couple of times, and it's scary. It's scary. It's scary for adults. It's particularly scary for children. And, you know, if I can avoid that, I'm going to avoid that. And that's just harder and harder to do these days.
Yeah, well, let's also remember, if you don't leave, you could be subject to like a 2-week period with no power. And it is difficult to live here with no power. There were 10 temperature-related deaths in Florida, just with, I guess it was Helene or Milton.
Yes.
One of the two. There were 10 people died from heat exposure because they had no power. And it was just too hot, too humid, and they were too frail. So, you know, there had been, historically, there was vertical evacuation. I remember that was something talked about in the 60s when I was a child. And people did go down to the Montleone Hotel and spend a hurricane in the hotel.
Yes.
You know, you can't do that with the whole city. There was an evacuation. A lot of people don't remember this, but Hurricane George, which I just had moved back a year previous, when Hurricane George came in, they did open the Superdome, and it was not the best experience for the city. There was a lot of vandalism and you know, they tore the place up, but it wasn't anything like the days-long slog of Katrina. You know, it was, the storm came and went. One of the things about George that I always find striking, and I tried to find the reference for this and I couldn't, but the floodwaters came within 18 inches of the top of the levees out on Hain Boulevard, the storm surge, and it was an almost Katrina. Another 18 inches,
wow,
or a weak spot on that side of the lake, we would have had Katrina in 1998 with, you know, the flooding. Well, it would have been in the east mostly. I think the Industrial Canal would have been a barrier, but still, it would have been a major flooding disaster. But since the railroad runs along there, I think that levee was much, and it is a real levee. It wasn't a flood wall, which is 19-foot piles where there should have been 60 foot and all that kind of stuff. Because it was a real levee, it did hold. But the fact remains,
New Orleans was doomed
18
to
inches.
flood. It was just a matter of when.
Yeah.
As it turns out,
as
you discovered, as with everything that you did and levees.org did, that's what we found out. And
we didn't
that
know
it
it
was
then.
just a matter of time. No one knew. No one knew that it was so poorly designed, funded, executed, maintained. And, and yes, nobody knew that. And which is, we are the ones. We were the experiment.
We were the experiment.
For the entire nation's addressing and looking at levees, and there's levees everywhere. If you live somewhere, you're probably got a levee near you.
2/3 of the population lives in counties protected by levees. But a segue from evacuation is warning, being told to get out. So we can talk about that for just a moment. So immediately after the flooding during Katrina, all the news reports said, "Oh, we were warned the levees could break. We were told the levees could break." Remember Hurricane Pam? 1 year in advance, there'd been Hurricane Pam when we should have known the levees would break. When the fact of the matter is, we know now, the research shows that there was not one single warning from any public official that these levees could breach and fail. And switching over to discuss those poor folks in North Carolina with Hurricane Helene, I remember 48 hours after that flooding, reading in online that the residents were warned that they should leave because those areas, these rivers, have a tendency to overtop and flood. And I doubted that. The moment I read that, and so talk about this for just a second. So first of all, I don't know if that's true or not, but you know what that does? You know what it puts in the mind of the reader? Anyone seeing that, especially not us three here, because we've been through it, anyone that's never been through anything like this will go, "Oh, look at that. They were warned. They should go, and they didn't. Well, this is their fault then." Think of the damage that does.
Yeah.
When I read in writing, they were warned, there's the people in this area that flooded were warned that this flooding could happen. I bet it's not true.
Well, even if they were warned with 48 hours notice, how do you do that? 48 hours is nothing.
Correct.
And that's for a big maybe. You don't know. We don't know. For all the science, we don't know where these things are going ultimately. We don't know when they're going to take a last minute turn. They rarely hit on a track that's provided to you days in advance anymore. They turn, they swiggle, they move, they do this. And so that's why you can't, there are no positives, there are no definites, I should say. And that's the problem with this, is that it's like fighting a shotgun, and you how do you do that? You can't get out of the way. I remember when we you mentioned the Monteleone. Yeah, I had friends who did that for Katrina. They went to the Monteleone. One was a manager at the at Acme Oyster House, and after 3 days, you're right. Whether you're in a nice hotel or not, if you don't have water and you don't have electricity, you don't have anything, it's hot, it's uncomfortable, and it's rotten. And so they actually went to the Acme Oyster House, and one of them had keys to their truck and got into their garage, took their truck, and that's how they got out. That they had the Acme Oyster House truck getting out. But I mean, it's things like that. And then also with the advanced warning and the warning, whatever, if they had or did not have from Helene going up into Asheville and whatnot. I remember during Katrina, we evacuated to the Delta of Mississippi to my in-laws, who had a house and they have a little farm out there. So we went there, and the storm followed us right up to that. That's the path it took. It went straight up the interstate. And so that night, while we were, we thought we had dodged a bullet. We didn't know that the levees had broken until the next morning. So the storm went by, and we were all so happy. And all of a sudden, the storm hit Mississippi, and we were in the house, and we had probably 9 tornadoes all around us. The roof heaved, hoed, it pulled off. We lost the roof. We had rain coming through the roof. I went up with my father-in-law and I, we went up on the roof and we tried to repair it, and I almost lost him because we were hammering, we were trying to put plastic up, and a gust came and nearly blew him off the roof. But I literally grabbed him by the shirt and held him onto the roof, and he almost went flying off. I mean, that's how these things happen. You know, we had no thought or warning that would happen.
No,
We didn't have any clue that would follow us and do what it did in Mississippi.
We
And then
also
the next day
evacuated
we left and
north.
went to Memphis.
And we went to Jackson, Mississippi. Now we didn't get
So right in
quite.
the
Now
right.
the Hurricane Katrina went more to the west.
Yes.
Excuse me, the east.
Yes, yes.
East. So you got it worse. But we
got
lost power, and the
Yes.
hotel we were staying at lost power, so we had to evacuate again.
Right.
For the hotel, and this time we went west and ended up in Lafayette, Louisiana, where we stayed till December. But you know, to your point is you don't know. You know, they have an idea where these storms are going.
Right.
That's why they call it spaghetti model.
Right. I think the best job in the world these days is probably meteorologist, because I don't know of any other job where you have to be less specific. You try, but you know, you've got a built-in excuse, but
well, in defense of the meteorologists, the spaghetti models have greatly improved.
That's true.
Since even the days of Katrina. And then there's the famous Hurricane George, again, as an example. Nash Roberts said it was going to go into Biloxi. The National Weather Service said New Orleans. Well, Nash was right, and the National Weather Service was wrong. And everybody thought Nash was doing this by gut feeling of the seat of his pants and all those computers. And Nash himself contributed to this by calling, you know, sort of impugning the computers as the problem. Well, the problem was the people reading the data on the computers weren't Nash Roberts. At that point, he was 80 years old, and he had 40 years of experience, including riding in the first hurricane hunter ever in the South Pacific for Admiral Nimitz during the war. I mean, he had the experience and could read the data. He also had a private company that got data off of production platforms in the Gulf from the various oil companies. Right. So Nash was well.
Do you call that cheating?
Well, yeah, in a way. And Nash was pretty magnanimous about, you know, I mean, he was proud of the fact he called it when the Weather Service didn't. But these other critics in the media and have said over time that, and just the general sense is, we can't trust these computers, we can't trust these models. But if you look at the performance of the models over the past 20 years, the spaghetti models do converge, and they do put the center of the storm where you think it's going to be. What we're starting to realize is the parameters or the variables in every storm are different. It can be big, it can be small. It can be a big rain event, it can have no rain. It can be a wind event, it can spawn tornadoes. Like in Florida, it wiped out a neighborhood well south of the eye. The 9 tornadoes went through a neighborhood and destroyed it.
And they wiggle.
Down by Fort Pierce.
And they don't go in straight lines. They wiggle.
But this wasn't even a wiggle. This was outlying band had a bunch of tornadoes on it. And then it gets to Asheville and dumps all this water and strips off mountaintops. There's pictures from the Blue Ridge Parkway where it looks like a desert. They've ripped out, you know, the trees are all gone or broken down. There's no foliage left. So there was some very high winds when that thing ran into the mountains. Well, and you know, nobody saw that coming, you know, and definitely Asheville. The thing that I come back to is, you know, there's arguments about how much is global warming or climate change. It really is climate change more than warming. How much is that affecting this? And you look at something like Asheville that had never happened to that extent, unprecedented floodwaters. And
not to that extent. That's correct.
No,
not to that extent.
Yeah, and to the extent where it washed away the fresh water supply and the pipes for the fresh water, they're really hurting up there.
Yeah, historic buildings, yes.
Historic buildings and parts of the infrastructure were destroyed. Like in particular, fresh water. You need fresh water for people to move back in. They're going to have to relay pipe. The Interstate 40 is not going to be ready west of Asheville for like 6 months. They have to reset the foundations of it. So nobody saw that. Nobody saw that coming. And the irony is, I know personally 2 families that moved to Asheville after Katrina and the flooding here.
Oh wow, yeah,
And
including my Stanford. Luckily he wasn't there when Helene arrived, but
Right.
but yes,
Yeah.
so everything you say is true, Stuart. These storms are getting worse. They're getting more unpredictable. We're getting better at predicting them, but the storms themselves are even more unpredictable.
Well,
And
even look at this year where we've got storms coming from every direction. They're not just coming from, the African coast or Cape Horn, they're not coming from, they are coming from there. But, we also had one that came from the south this year, and we had one that came from the east, which is almost unprecedented. I mean,
one of them jumped over the Central America from the
jumped
Pacific.
over Central America. How does that happen? I mean, as we all know, when a hurricane hits land, it's supposed to dissipate. It's supposed to lose its energy.
Right.
It's supposed to lose the warmth from the water and
get chopped
follow
up by
storm.
fronts. And
this with these. And that, the only, I mean, I think they're trying to figure out that one too, but it certainly seems like it's a warming issue where things are still warm over land and it has enough fuel to make the trek across the land.
The water or the air itself being on average warmer has a higher capacity to carry moisture. So that is a major factor in how much rain you're going to get. And that happened with Hurricane Harvey. That was another one that took everybody by surprise. But something that was really interesting, it was last week, October 24th, the Washington Post did a story about how, and this speaks to the insurance point you brought up earlier, Rudy, that the amount of settlement, civilization, and development in vulnerable areas is what is driving the huge losses as much or more than an increase in storm intensity or various meteorological metrics that you can apply to a storm. It's the fact that people have moved in, built up, and not prepared for what a region historically experienced over eons. You take it's like building a large development out in Ruddock Ruddock out there on the west of Lake Pontchartrain or Tasmanchak. You wouldn't build subdivisions out there, and they were going to put subdivisions east of Paris Road, where I-510 is now. Mm-hmm. There are 2 defunct interchanges that was slated to be developed, and then as the city's growth modulated downward and it became apparent that we needed some wetlands, that was the wild, and also we had wildlife conservation issues around that. It became the wildlife refuge that it is now. But that was originally going to be New Orleans East all the way out to Irish Bayou, just
and we know better now. Stuart, we know better now. We know better now. We did a lot of things 50 years ago we wish we hadn't have done. Bringing in exotic plants that don't belong here and bringing the bugs
palm
with
tree.
We know now. Don't bring in exotic plant. Don't bring in exotic animals or exotic bugs. We know now. That would be like going out for a suntan on the beach. You know better to do that. Mm-hmm. To deliberately burn yourself. So meanwhile, Stuart, would you say that despite everything we know, it's still going on? This overdevelopment?
I mean, just take a drive down US 98 along Florida and look at Mexico Beach, which was hit by Michael. Was that 6 years ago, 7 years ago? It was wiped out because it was built up right next to the ocean. It was just vulnerable. Now that one, it's a little bit unfair to say that they didn't learn the lesson. A lot of those structures were built in the 60s and 70s. But the point is they were there. They weren't there in the 50s. There could have been a massive storm that hit the Big Bend of Florida and wouldn't have made the news because there was no one living in that area. And you take the area past that, from Apalachicola down to Crystal River, it's still mostly swamp and mostly unsettled. What they found, though, is that what we're finding is the increase in intensity and the increase in rain and moisture content. We're getting these effects inland
and frequency
in Perry and Lake City and places like that.
Would that
Wow.
include frequency? The frequency of the
Yeah,
storms?
well,
Because it seems like we have more closer together, not just closer, we have more over the whole span of the entire season. And that the season
yeah,
itself really is almost doesn't have distinguished marks anymore. I mean, it kind of just goes till the end of the year and it starts up the beginning of the year.
yeah. I think
I
the
mean,
season is getting longer. The one that's really getting longer is the tornado season in the Midwest.
yeah,
That is
that's true.
expanding
Wow.
significantly. They're
That's
getting
so true.
tornadoes in December. They never got them before February. That's not. Fortunately, that belt. Fortunately for us, I should say, that belt is north of us.
Yeah.
But
I'm so
it,
glad you brought that up with myself being from Chicago. And I was actually really literally thinking that that's a point that I wanted to make too, because, I have friends and family and everything there. And so that's a particular interest to me as well. And that the storms are just coming from all angles, all over, all the time. And I
Mhm.
mean, that's what else can be our focus other than because what else is going to drive prices up more than your homeowner's insurance? And no matter where you are in the country, if you're vulnerable, and more of us are vulnerable, you don't just have to be on the coast. You don't have to, you can be inland, you can be in the Midwest, you can be anywhere. You can be in a wildfire in Oregon, you can be in a tornado in Chicago, and you can be in a hurricane in New Jersey. And
mhm,
these are the things that are going to drive up our prices more than anything else in the entire world.
Right. Right. So it's
mhm.
been 20 years almost since Hurricane Katrina. Let's talk for just a moment about the differences in federal response since in the 20 years. The federal response now to Helene and Milton, which are the most recent. And well, Francine wasn't that much for us. Francine was just a windy night, but
You mean
compared
again what?
relatively.
Yeah. You mean
So
What
again
was
what was invented in New Orleans, which was FEMA response.
FEMA response. Well, I'll
That
point out
really
one
where
big
it kicked
difference.
into action, where it was really tested, where it was really found out that there really wasn't one before Katrina.
Right.
They
Right.
never experienced it. But of course, I mean, to anybody's credit, no one had gone through what happened, that
Right.
the
Right.
levees
So
failing, the city flooding. I mean, we made it through the hurricane by and large,
right.
but it was the flooding of the city that
Right.
created such a
Right.
catastrophe.
And a big challenge. I mean, so many people, I'd love to know what the number is. A lot of people didn't evacuate because the bus wouldn't let them take their
Yeah.
pets. And they stayed with their pets and then drowned with their pets. So after that, FEMA, the Congress passed a law called the Pets Act, PETS, that said in order to get compensation and help from FEMA, you have to accommodate people's pets. And it wasn't about the
Yes.
pet, it was about the owners. So
Hey,
that's one
yeah.
big difference.
This is not FEMA, but this is again just the coordination of all the entities and where you can go and where you can't. I met a gentleman about a month ago who was in the very front of the pack of the line of the group that was going across the Crescent City Connection Bridge from New Orleans to Gretna,
yeah,
trying to go across, and they were stopped by Gretna police and literally having shotguns fired right over their heads.
Some of those people
that
were in wheelchairs.
Some of those people were in wheelchairs, and as a matter of fact,
that story
the
is one
gentleman
of the
that I
most
was talking to was pushing someone in a wheelchair.
Yeah, they was a very
that
slow
is
moving
that,
bunch.
that is one of the most undertold, one of the most
Oh,
buried stories that come out of
Yeah.
the entire experience. It's the
it is one
fact
of
that
my
one
most
city
told.
put up a barrier to people coming across
Yes,
to
sir.
get out of New Orleans.
It's
It amazes me that didn't get more attention, partly because we were just before we got to the smartphone. Everybody didn't have cameras at the ready,
Hmm.
uh, and there's no video of it.
such a great point.
It was there wasn't any local news coverage. There
Yeah.
weren't news cameras around, but that is an amazing story that uh, I've often wondered about that. And
Hmm.
I think
So
about it when I go across the bridge now. I always think,
Every
gee,
time, I still do to this day. I think about it all the time.
uh
Anytime Gretna comes up in my head, that's what pops into my head.
huh.
For good, for
No,
bad, it's true.
there were. I'm for those of you watching this on video. I'm holding up my smartphone. We didn't have those 20 years ago, and
Right.
there was so many things probably are buried like this story because we don't have videos of it. There's right now NPR, and not even not NPR, National Geographic and Netflix are all putting together their Katrina documentaries. I get phone calls and emails all the time. Do you know of anyone who has any video footage? I said, no. I said, the only people with video footage are pros, professional cameramen, like the TV station.
Right.
That's it.
Mm.
So
I mean,
that's a really big difference between then and now.
Yeah. After that gentleman told me his story, I felt like I was right back 20 years ago, to be honest with you. And when he was done, we both were on the verge of tears again, and we both just had to hug each other again. You know, just like back when you finally saw someone for the first time after you came back, you hugged them, and then you looked at him for a little bit, and you had to hug him again. I mean, it was we were in the land of the double hugs. Just to, you're
I
here,
remember the
I see
hugging.
you, you're here. Yes,
I remember the hugging.
absolutely.
And also keep in mind, for the listener, this is all over the country hearing this. The people live in Asheville, Carolina right now, like the same as us 20 years ago. We were busy surviving.
Yeah.
Where am I going
Yeah.
to live? Where am I going to work? Where are my kids going to go to school? How am I going to
Right.
eat?
How do I get a roof? How do I get a tarp? How do I get plastic sheeting on the top of my head so I can keep my house dry?
We were literally
That's
in
where you end
survival
up.
mode.
You end up going right back to the ultimate basics. You're thrust into an entirely different world. And when we went through Katrina, the phones that we did have, they didn't work for I don't know how long. I mean, you couldn't get a hold
Months.
of anyone. There wasn't the
Months.
network that there is now.
Months.
You were lucky to be able to text somebody. That was
Right.
the only thing that
Mhm.
seemed to even work. Even all the emergency responders, all of their communications went down. Everything went down, and so you were left to your wits
Mhm.
for the most part. And when
Hopefully
something
that the
like this
last
happens,
time,
right?
hopefully that the last time in human history that an entire gigantic metropolis is completely cut off from the rest of the world.
Thrust
Hopefully
into
it's
the
the last time.
darkness. Yeah, we were definitely thrust into the darkness. And when something like this happens, and Florida, Asheville, anywhere it happens, it puts you in a position to test everything about you, and everything about your neighbor, and everything about your government. And one thing you do learn real fast is that if you have to rely on the government, it's not a position you want to be in. And that's not a dig or anything like that. It's just never the position you want to be in, is to have to be dependent on the public entity to help you out, because that's probably the slowest moving entity you're ever going to work with, no matter what. And so it's just to be thrust into that and not really have much choice is very difficult, very frustrating, and it takes time to recover from. And that's the one thing, that is most precious. So when
That's true unless you need paper towels in Puerto Rico. You'll get those and delivered.
Bada bing.
Yeah, right off the podium. There you go.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So yeah, you get paper towels, you're set. No, but I mean, we water, everything else is if you have to rely on others to do that for you, it's the hardest thing to have to go through. It really is one of the very hardest things you'll ever experience.
So,
I want to throw out there that they're still having trouble in Asheville with telecommunications. There are people not connected. They lost major trunk lines and fiber connections to the towers, and it's going to be some time before full service is restored. And being in the mountains, it's already spotty service to begin with.
Yes, I mean, and everything their worst occurrence was just so much water rushing, and you can't stop water. I mean, if it decides to go someplace, it's very difficult to stop. I mean, we know that as much as anyone. And that just does a whole different level of harm to your infrastructure, because it doesn't just when New Orleans flooded, we had the horror of all of that water just sitting in our city for a couple weeks, and just the
they
weight
claimed it would
on
be
the
months,
pipes.
but it was
Right.
actually weeks, but that was bad enough.
It was bad enough. I mean, you have the weight of all that water on the streets, all the weight of all that water on your infrastructure, all your piping, all your sewage. And, I mean, and all of our infrastructure is quite old to begin with. We're talking about a lot of 100-year-old pipes to begin with. And, and that puts quite a strain on everything. it loosens up everything, loosens up your trees, it loosens up your signs.
Did you
it
know that
loosens
there was
up
actually
everything.
there was actually one positive thing about that water? It actually reduced the mercury. It kind of spread the mercury around and thinned it out. So the mercury problem was actually improved.
That's
Maybe
good.
the mercury all went out to the ocean. I don't know, but
Well,
there's
let's keep that
less
one to
mercury
ourselves
in New
because
Orleans.
someone will suggest doing it again.
Well, we're about running out of time. So if there's any thoughts that you really wanted to put out there for our listeners and for hopefully we have listeners that have suffered from Hurricanes Helene and Milton, do you have any last words, you guys?
Well, the end of hurricane season approaches, so that set of disaster will go away for at least until next summer. So we'll see you next summer. But
yeah, just we got to hold on and hold on to each other and really start working together to come up with solutions. And it's not just hyperbole. I mean, we don't have much choice. We're not going to get better. This isn't going to get better. It's going to get more extreme. And we have to be cognizant of that and be blunt with our politicians and our representatives, no matter who they are, about this. This is the problem of the century, probably, is the climate affecting everything that we do and everything that we face.
Well said, Rudy. And the only thing I can add is you've got to keep a sense of humor. After the levees broke in New Orleans, my friend, Mr. Lonzy Beeman, would say, for months I couldn't get to my place because there was a house in the middle of the street. And you have to laugh, you have to laugh about it.
Yeah,
and
it's amazing how a dark humor can buoy you, at least for a little bit.
Yeah. And don't forget the hugs.
And
the hugs.
Hugging is very important.
Thank you, Rudy and Stuart, for joining me today. And thank you, the listeners, for joining us on the Slingshot from levees.org. We'll see you again in about 2 weeks. Bye-bye. Okay, stay with me a second.